Spanning the globe, it's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Kraig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to another season of International Focus and our World Affairs Roundup. Our Roundup regulars have returned from their pricey vacation in the Hamptons to offer their penetrating and insightful takes on nuclear reactions. This week, the Obama administration secured the final votes needed to ensure the Iran nuclear deal will survive a mostly hostile Congress. We'll look at fallout from the campaign trail and beyond. Hospitality and hostility in the EU. The refugee crisis in Europe has strained the EU ideal of free movement across borders. How has the current wave of asylum seekers from Africa and the Middle East exposed new fissures on the continent? Rain on the parade. China's muscle-flexing parade commemorating victory over Japan in World War II took place as its stock markets were in free fall, shedding trillions of dollars in a few days' time. What do these events suggest about China's political and economic trajectory in the months ahead? And Putin's Arctic adventures. Offering an extremely generous interpretation of international law, Russia has claimed exclusive rights to nearly 500,000 square miles of the Arctic Sea. Beyond his fondness for polar bears, what's behind Vladimir Putin's latest land grab? Well, first of all, welcome back, everyone. Well, let's start with the Iran deal, and we can start with some of the reactions from the campaign trail. On the Republican side, there was something less than enthusiasm. You see, Jeb Bush characterized it as dangerous, deeply flawed, and short-sighted. Far worse than anything I ever dreamed it could be, says Lindsey Graham. One of America's worst diplomatic failures, says Scott Walker. Mike Huckabee says Obama will take the Israelis and march them to the door of the oven. And of course, Donald Trump says only very stupid people are in favor of it. Well, are any of you the very stupid people who are in favor of this deal? John, let's start with you.
It's a complicated issue. Yes, there's obviously some thoughtful and a number of not so thoughtful people on both sides of this issue. I looked at the composition of the people who reached this agreement with Iran, and this was the permanent members of the UN Security Council: the United States, Russia, China, England, France, plus Germany. And what I came to the conclusion is, while there may be flaws to this agreement, they're moving, whether or not we move with it. And so that, as I think I mentioned earlier, that horse is out of the barn now, and so we better start reacting and adjusting and how we're going to deal with Iran. So
it's clearly not a bilateral situation at all. That's so right. We could move ourselves into a position of irrelevance on it. So, and what about the domestic aspect of this? To what extent do you think that it was positioned as kind of a litmus test on support for Israel in Congress?
Well, I think that it definitely has been presented as a litmus test for Israel, and I think that's unfortunate. It doesn't look, as you said in the introduction, it doesn't look as if the Israeli side is going to win, and so they'll have to deal with the reality of the agreement. I think it's also just about election politics and what people think about the Obama administration to begin with, and a very if you look at the ads that came out against the agreement, they were intended to scare, very misleading in terms of the information, and very much caught up in the whole cycle of presenting the Obama administration as incredibly dangerous, every single thing we do, and basically getting in bed with our enemies. And so it's It's a lot of distortion of information, I think, out there.
So when the calculus is done at the end of the day, was this a net plus or a net minus for the administration, do you think, given all the wrangling that accompanied it?
Well, Obama is not on the ballot again. And so I think it'll be a net plus. It's going to be, his major diplomatic accomplishment. And he opened up his whole administration with an idea of opening to Iran. There were a lot of bumps in the road, but he's accomplished an agreement with them that, does have the strongest inspection regime that we've ever had in a nuclear agreement, and does reduce the chances of Iran becoming a nuclear state, regardless of the misinformation that's been put up there. And, responsible Republican figures who aren't in politics now, and like Brent Scowcroft, who worked for President Ford and President H.W. Bush, have supported this and pointed out, as John did, that it was bilateral. The problem is when you have in a presidential campaign, you get a cartoonish image of foreign policy where there are cardboard cutout bad guys and good guys, and he's siding with the bad guys. And it's in primaries, so it's appealing to the most active part of the conservative base right now, which basically thinks you have to be against anything that is compromised with quote-unquote evil. And so it's kind of interesting, though, that the public still believes in general in diplomacy. So it remains to be seen how this would play out in a general election or how this will play out long term. It depends in part on what happens. I mean, if Iran starts violating the deal next year, then of course it's going to play differently than if this seems to work. And if it seems to work well enough that Iran stops funding, terrorist groups as much as they've been doing around the Middle East, then it'll be seen as a tremendous success. But right now, in the Republican primaries right now, you can't be far enough right. So you have Jeb Bush attacking it, but being somewhat responsible and saying you'd look at the deal when you became president, then being attacked for not canceling it the first day. And so it becomes silly season as to who can cancel it quicker, just whether or not the president would have the authority to do so or not, or as John said, whether or not it's even possible or worthwhile when it's a bilateral agreement and the sanctions have already been traded away.
Multilateral.
Multilateral, right.
So,
it's multilateral, not bilateral, correct.
So let's pull back to a little wider lens here and look at sort of the larger environment in which this takes place. First of all, do you think the Israelis have come to terms with it, and what will they want? What's the quid pro quo after that?
The king of Saudi Arabia is coming for a visit, and I'm expecting to see a nice list of enhancements for their security situation. I also expect that Israel will be receiving a number of enhancements for their security arrangement as a quid pro quo for this agreement.
So, does this represent a very high-profile failure on the part of AIPAC and others who lobbied so vociferously against it? I mean, is this a crack in the wall?
Hard to say. I mean, I think that Obama, it's a success for Obama, but all he has to get is 34 senators. So you can argue the other way as well and say, that's not really great support for this agreement, and there is an election coming up, and so the whole thing could change once we have a new president, as we're being told time and time again. There will still be an agreement, though, with the other powers, and Iran. Sanctions will be relieved against Iran, and hopefully they will not be working on their nuclear capabilities. They'll be respecting the agreement. So, it can be cast as a failure in a way, just because it doesn't have tremendous support within the Congress.
I'd say it's more of a defeat for Likud and Netanyahu. I mean, he put AIPAC and any hardliners in the U.S. in a difficult position by lobbying directly and intervening in the relationship between Congress and the president. And so they were put in a position of needing to back him up in some way, and that is not played out well. Also, everyone knows well that a lot of the Republicans voting against this might vote for it if it meant actually killing it. In other words, they're allowing a procedure to go place so they could be in place so they're on the record voting against it, but it's also going forward.
Yes. I almost see this as more an indictment of our primary process than of the Iran agreement.
So the politics did not end at the water there in this case. Well, speaking of the water, let's talk about another situation, the refugee crisis in the EU. And one of the things that's come to the fore is an agreement maybe a lot of people weren't aware of, the 1985 Schengen Agreement. And what did that bind countries to do?
Basically created a zone within Europe in which people could travel freely, so that once you entered one of the countries of Europe that was in the Schengen zone, you could travel freely and not have to show your passport across borders. So this is one of the major issues, because once refugees or migrants, depending on your perspective, arrive, they can move on to another country without actually claiming any kind of status in the first country of their arrival. And it actually contradicts, to a certain extent, another agreement called the Dublin Agreement, by which the members of the EU agreed that refugees arriving should claim asylum in the first country where they arrive. So they're not doing that.
And how is this playing out between countries in Europe now, in terms of sort of new limits on that sort of mobility across borders?
Well, I mean, the issue right now is that you also have a resurgence of nationalist, mostly right-wing political parties that are, even if they're not in power, putting pressure on mainline European politicians. And you have this, because of all the unrest, you have this amazing flood of refugees, though it's a bit of a definitional thing. Some want to call them migrants, as to suggest that they don't deserve human rights status, and so there's that is all up in play. But you have some countries, such as Sweden and Germany, that have taken a lot more of the refugees, and others that are resisting. And then you have the issue of the entry countries, Italy and Greece, being very burdened by this and trying to get support from the richer countries and feeling like it's not been forthcoming. But with this number of people, there's going to be a shock to the system regardless. But really, the EU has been very slow to respond, and it's still very much up in the air. They're not, even though they have done things such as created free border movement and created a unified Europe, they've not created exactly a nimble Europe that's able easily to make decisive decisions. And it really is a human rights crisis that needs to be dealt with.
You know, you look at this from on the economic side, which is one of the other issues that they're wrestling with still. And we have, it was a north-south issue. Well, there's a north-south dimension to this, but there's also an east-west dimension, with Hungary being the poster child for a resistance to what the Germany and others would like to see imposed on the entire EU. Also, the public opinion polls in Germany have Merkel in a big drop in terms of popularity because of her position on this. There is a cultural dimension to this that is harder to bring up and harder to put into context. But when you're talking about the amount of refugees that are coming in, that changes the chemistry within countries.
Mm-hmm.
So just very quickly before our break, what then are some kind of the pre-existing fault lines that this crisis is exacerbating, do you think?
There's definitely the north-south, as John said, and the poorer countries being asked to bear the economic burden of the large numbers of people arriving there. There's a huge ideological fault line between liberal European values and more conservative nationalist values. And there's an interesting fault line between, well, it depends on the country of origin of the refugees. It's fine apparently it's for some people are in favor of, for example, accepting educated Syrians, but not Libyans coming who are not educated. So and that's not one of the criteria for acceptance of refugees.
Someone suggested it shouldn't be a refugee beauty pageant where you get to pick and choose like that.
Right.
But the bad side about all this is it's not going away.
Right.
No.
Right.
And this is going to be on Europe's doorstep for the foreseeable future.
And there's no reason it shouldn't be on ours either, because there's no reason that the United States shouldn't be asked to accept refugees. I mean, really, when you think about it.
Okay, well, you can come and live with you.
It shows the importance of the unrest itself that's causing, so maybe there's more of a focus there. Plus, there's all this fear of the German position, which is sort of went out in Hungary for where they go, which suggests, we'll take the doctors.
Right.
you take the 70-year-old who's very sick and who doesn't have an occupation.
Well, this will be one I'm sure we'll be looking at throughout the coming year. But right now, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to our World Affairs Roundup with John Katzka and Hamilton and Robert Kraig. Well, now let's turn to China, which had an interesting few weeks at the end of summer. There was, just this past week, a very high-profile public spectacle commemorating ostensibly the 70th anniversary of the defeat of the Japanese Empire in World War II. But many people suggested it was really designed to convey other messages, but that very high-profile sort of military coming-out party took place in the context of a stock market sell-off and meltdown, and there was actually an official who used the term Black Monday for China. So what happened? First of all, on the economic side.
Well, it's very interesting as China moves into a kind of state version of capitalism. That guess what? Capitalism has ups and downs, to say the least, and boom and bust. And they had relatively unregulated stock markets that ran up huge bubbles. I mean, the bubbles, the valuation gaps were much bigger than you see in United States and Western Europe. And the bubble burst. And the leadership responded rather in a panicky sort of way, tried to devalue the currency very publicly when the currency had developed as one of the more stable currencies in the world. And so what it really brings up is not only is it a shock to the world economy because it's second economy and the largest economy in the world, all has to do with the transition, whether or not China can transition from a manufacturing economy to a consumer economy, which is what their objective is. They're not going to have the 12% per year growth rates anymore, and whether or not they can continue to maintain control of the economy with the Communist Party and have a vibrant capitalist system. So it's both brought up the whole question of the future of China. Some people think that it's a threat to the whole Chinese system. Most don't. Most think it's a major bump in the road, though. But it's certainly a bump in the road in terms of the world economy and what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And it's a major question for politics in China and whether or not they can retain the kind of party control over a growing capitalist economy and whether they can make a transition to a consumer economy or not. But obviously, China has now become part of the world economy, which has certain benefits and certain risks, which we're now seeing.
You look pensive. Do you have something to add to that, John?
Yeah, I think to a degree we've overblown the importance of this. This was an overdue correction, as well as our own market was an overdue correction in terms of bringing the stock prices back in line.
Well, I mean, there's a truism that the stock market is not the economy.
Exactly. Well, and especially in China, where property is much more important than equity, than the stocks. Mm-hmm. So you have to consider that as well.
And I think more important than what happened to the stock market itself was the failure of the government to the measures that it took to try and actually stop the fall. And this coming also very close to the explosions in Tianjin, which exposed high-level corruption and just a terrible, terrible tragedy, the results of which are still playing themselves out, all cast the government in a very, very bad light at a time when they're trying to, with this parade, to look all-powerful.
Exactly. I mean, that's part of the game, isn't it, in a society where the government is trying to posture itself as omnipotent and having its hand on all the levers of power when something like this happens. And I think it's significant, too, that ordinary Chinese citizens were encouraged to participate in the stock market. They were saying this is your patriotic duty. So it wasn't just the core of elites who probably saw damage to their portfolio.
Also in this, we're watching Xi Jinping taking over the entire party apparatus and sending to mothballs people who have been hanging around on the periphery, serving as the elders to the party, and cleaning house of these people. So there's a lot of movement going on, as Robert pointed out, as they move from a export oriented to a consumer economy.
So then, how does the parade play into that? We saw military hardware that had never been unveiled before. It was quite a fulsome display of Chinese military might.
Well, as Ann was pointing out, it's greatly embarrassing to the Chinese leadership. They've tried to say that they have a version of capitalism that's better than the Western version, isn't going to be vulnerable to boom and bust. And so it's humiliating to them. And so then they have, of course, this show of force. And perhaps some people say they should stop making various imperialistic pronouncements about various islands that belong to other countries. This could actually increase that effect if they feel insecure. And so it really is, it's as much a political challenge as anything else.
So were there any other sort of underlying purposes of this sort of pageantry? Who was the audience for this parade?
It reminded me of May Day in Moscow. Mm-hmm. And there's a backdrop to this. Literally on the eve of, Xi Jinping announced that they were going to cut the military by 300,000 troops. Simply because what they're looking for is a more tech-oriented, more sophisticated military than they have presently. Now, where that goes, I don't know.
Well, as we're running out of time, let's turn to another part of the world you know well, and what could possibly be a very cold war. This is the Russian activities in the Arctic. John, what were the Russian claims that sort of put them back in the news?
Well, it's historic. I mean, Russia has, under the Tsars, they spent enormous amounts of money in the 1700s in terms of exploring the regions up there. 60% of the land up in the Arctic area is Russian. 80% of the population up there is Russian. So they have more of a stake in that part of the world than and in any other country. Maybe is, in fact, more than all the other countries combined. Now, we're late to the game.
So, Ann, are you as comfortable with these Russian claims as your colleague seems to be, or do you think it is a little bit...
Well, I think that, in 2001, they went before this commission that reviews claims regarding the continental shelf, and it was thrown out. So I'm not quite sure what has changed, except that it's gotten warmer there, so the Russians want, so there's possibility for more transit every year. So the economic potential is getting greater with global warming.
And energy.
Yes, and so, but I think, it's similar to the Chinese situation. It's all symbols. They put a flag by the North Pole, a few years back, a Russian flag, but there are 8 countries that border it, and I do realize that the percentages are definitely on the Russian side, but there is international law that is supposed to be regulating this, and we'll see what happens. I think certainly that's a huge push, nationalist push, and I think this idea that the Arctic has always been Russian and it's part of who the Russians are is very, very powerful for them.
I really was not saying that I was in favor of their pushing their way up there.
And the Russians used to own Alaska, sold it to us. They'd have even more of a stake if they'd not sold it in the mid-19th century. But this is nationalistic posturing like the parade in China. Yeah. And by the way, it probably has less impact than messing around in Ukraine anymore. So it's a cheaper kind of nationalism.
So it's a very good sort of chest-thumping nationalism, and there are, of course, the real economic opportunities as the area becomes more navigable. But what about the strategic situation? I mean, they're talking about having a more permanent and robust military presence there as well. Is there anything to that?
It's a very cold place to try to have a military presence.
There is an icebreaker gap. They have more icebreakers than we do, and perhaps we can work on that in the next administration.
We have plans for 14 airfields and...
Yes.
I mean, the truth is from global warming, not only does it make it more navigable, it's all the more important that we leave most of that energy in the ground if we're not going to have a global climate cataclysm, unfortunately, not catechism, cataclysm.
You work on that one, Robert.
Well, we haven't heard a great deal about the environmental impact of what may be happening up there by the Russians, so we'll assume that's not a priority. But
one other point that we should mention, the U.S. Geological Survey has estimated that about 20% of the undiscovered energy, both gas and petroleum, is up there in the Arctic area. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously a major interest of all the parties involved here.
Not for nothing, as they say. Well, I'm afraid that will have to do it for this installment. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.